It's so lovely to see all of you, considering that it's minus 20 outside. So, bravo for coming out on this cold and chilly night. My name is Indabir Singh-Riar, and I'm an associate professor in the Azrieli School of Architecture and Urbanism at Carleton University. And I'm delighted to welcome you to an evening of reflection on the crisis of our time, namely the housing question. I wish especially to thank the Ottawa chapter of the Urban Land Institute for supporting tonight's lecture. And before we get started, I'm going to invite Dina Sarhan and Ross Ferris of the ULI to come forward and introduce us to their organization. So Dina and Ross, please.
All right, good evening, everybody, and don't know how that happened. Just go back. There we go. Welcome to tonight's event. On behalf of ULI Ottawa, we'd like to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us, and we'd also like to extend a special thank you to Carleton University for partnering with ULI Ottawa and supporting us in hosting this incredible gathering tonight. My name's Ross Ferris. I'm the co-chair of ULI Ottawa alongside my colleague Dina Sarhan. Together, for those of you who might not be familiar with the Urban Land Institute, or ULI, it's a global, member-driven organization dedicated to shaping the future of the built environment. There's over 48,000 members worldwide, and ULI brings together professionals from all aspects of land use and real estate to share knowledge, inspire innovation, and foster collaboration through various events that occur throughout the year. ULI Ottawa specifically was established in 2018 and has since worked to grow a vibrant network of local professionals in real estate, construction, design, basically representing all career stages as well. Throughout the year, we host a variety of events, including walking tours, lectures, panel discussions, and social gatherings, all aimed at fostering connections and advancing our knowledge in our industry. Our events are open to both members and non-members, with special pricing available to members and students to ensure accessibility. And just as a brief preview, in the coming months, you can anticipate events focused on revitalizing Ottawa's nightlife, commercial to residential building conversions, mass timber buildings, just to name a few. And Dina?
And one of ULI Ottawa's main priorities is to really support young leaders emerging in their careers. We have a variety of programs, such as our YLG program, as well as our Pathways program, that offer a lot of mentorship opportunities, networking opportunities. We even have some scholarships, and so if anyone in the crowd is interested in joining ULI, whether as a student or a mentee, come see Ross and I after the event, and we can speak to you more about how you can take advantage of some of these great opportunities for young leaders and in their early careers. Without further delay, we'll give the floor back to our speaker.
It looks like there's a few seats up there for those that are gathered.
Maybe we'll just take 30 seconds, so folks, if you want to come in, there's still some seats in the back. Dina and Ross, thank you so much. And, it's very encouraging to know that there's scholarship money, because there's young people in the audience who need the money. So, guys, please come down and ask them for a handout. What can I say? This year's forum series comes from the founding sponsor's commitment to situate architecture as a matter of public concern. Speakers have arrived from all points of the globe. The calendar continues in February with the remarkable Chilean office Del Rio Architects. 3 exciting voices are coming in March. United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing, Balakrishnan Rajagopal, Canadian Centre for Architecture Director of Collections, Martine de Vletter, and Indigenous Australian architect Jack Gilmer, who recently has been awarded the commission of the Venice Biennial Pavilion. It's quite a lineup, and we look forward to seeing you at each event. Tonight's lecture, like all others, occurs on traditional and unceded lands of the Algonquin Nation. Land, in our Western imaginations, assumes property. Property presumes ownership. Ownership enables use and exchange and profit. Profit begets expansion. Expansion allows consolidation. Consolidation spurs development, and development signifies property. And so we go round and round until public realms privatize, services diminish, cities splinter, and haves divide from have-nots. This, of course, is a caricature, but not off the mark in our free market with corporations and developers, or for that matter, Silicon Valley, upheld as problem solvers simply by virtue of possessing the capital to transform how and where we live. Architecture for the people is devalued, reduced to interchangeable styles of LEED-certified hip contemporaneity. Just think of all that thick metal paneling and those thin strip mullions. Life, liberty, and property, the great John Locke offered as foundational statement on Enlightenment belief in just society. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the great Thomas Jefferson added as revolutionary rejoinder. Maybe we'll let all these young people, do their thing. They're here for property. Can they squeeze in? There are a couple of seats right here in the front. Don't be shy, sit in the front. Okay, I'm going to remind you of Locke and Jefferson one more time, and then we'll continue. Life, liberty, and property, the great John Locke offered his foundational statement on enlightened belief in just society. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the great Thomas Jefferson added as revolutionary rejoinder. Not to vulgarize these noble creeds, but how to imagine the slip or the slippage or the slippery slope between property and happiness today. How to see ownership of home, of public space, as nobler ideal of some civic good or better commons. Such questions keep our speaker awake at night. Rowan Moore, who's arrived from London, is the architecture critic of the British Sunday newspaper, The Observer. His incisive reviews and moving appreciations also run in The Guardian. Moore trained as an architect at Cambridge University. A short stint in practice provoked a long career in journalism. The typewriter was to prove mightier than the drafting board. Moore joined The Observer in 2010. The British Press Awards soon named him Critic of the Year. His 2012 book, Why We Build, received the International Bruno Zevi Book Award. The next book, Slow Burn City, of 2016, explores London's unprecedented 21st century transformations. Moore's property, The Myth That Built the World, appeared in 2023. The title, again, Property, The Myth That Built the World, the title serves as sobering reminder of twin phenomena. First, that the last global economic catastrophe originated in the mortgage industry. And second, that calamities such as the coronavirus pandemic or the California wildfires prompt the same old anodyne call to build back better. Political sloganeering that in the dominant paradigm of real estate speculation means architecture that is not durable, not useful, not beautiful, but merely profitable. It is thus worth quoting one of Rowan Moore's recent Observer articles. A long look at new Spanish public housing turns on the following assessment. These notable efforts, whether a homeless women's shelter or a cooperative apartment block, provide architecture, Moore writes, that speaks of calm and care, not desperation and last resorts. He adds, there's a level of imagination and determination in some of the best European projects that Britain's risk-averse public agencies have yet to match. Ditto Canada. Moore's critique challenges these sacred cows of marketplace as fix, of ground rent as natural law, of star architect as savior. Moore's vantage, after all, owes to coming of age as an architecture student under Thatcher's great unraveling, and writing today under that dark Brexit cloud. This 40-year historical arc of intertwining neoliberalism and populism is not complete. Our guest is here to tell us why, and most of all, why things can and should change for the better. Please join me in welcoming Rowan Moore to the podium.
Well, thank you, Indabir, for that great introduction, which I'll try and live up to. And thank you, as he said, for coming out on this extremely cold night. It's just fabulous to see so many people. When you give a talk like this, you have absolutely no idea whether it's going to be 5 or a full house. So it's really nice to see you. So, as Indabir was saying, I write for The Observer, which is a newspaper that also appears on the Guardian website for now. We've just been bought by someone else, so that's going to change. And this is some of the things I write about as an architecture critic, the portrayal of architecture in films like The Brutalist, an obituary of a wonderful architect called Richard Gibson, who devoted his life to building social housing on the Shetland Islands, which are the furthest north part of the United Kingdom. A review of a new building, a new dance theatre, etc. Notre Dame, the rebuilding of Notre Dame, and so on. I also write books. This is my latest. This is the new edition of that is coming out next week. I think it's the first time that cover's been seen in public, maybe. Anyway, it will be available to all good online retailers. And it's a book about property, as it says. And really, it's looking at how this idea of private property, which is supposed to make everyone happy and rich and free, and which is supposed to make nations happy and rich and free, and sometimes does, quite often it does, and which John Locke saw as this great emancipating force, also can have the opposite effect and can also create division, inequality, a world of haves and have-nots. And what Indabir was talking about life, liberty, and property as against life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is maybe something we could discuss afterwards. So I'm going to talk today particularly about the British experience because it's what I know about. Also because I expect there are very similar issues at play in this country. It's kind of worldwide phenomenon that I'm describing. And thirdly, because Britain has played, I think, a particularly active role in promoting the idea of private property and the kind of architectural consequences of that, and also in promoting some of the alternatives to that, historically rather than in the present. So this is a poster from the 1920s. Metroland is a district of London that was built around the Metropolitan Railway. And this image kind of represents a dream that I think we're all familiar with of the individual house with a garden. It doesn't have to be hugely grand. It has a sort of cottagey style. And it's something to which a lot of people might aspire. And this is the Danish architect Rasmussen putting it. There's a Dane in the audience, so I'm not going to try and pronounce his first two names. And he wrote a fantastic book, London, the Unique City, in the 1930s, where he just saw the sort of London way of life as fantastic. And he made this sort of great statement of that ideal of the sort of individual family house. So I'll just leave you to read that. Okay, and then to add to that, which he also talks about, is not just about the house, it's about the community, it's about shared sports fields and schools and places where people can thrive as a community. So we have that dream. This is where we are now. So this is a very similar house to the one you saw in the first image. And that's how much it costs, which I think is about 2 million Canadian dollars. So clearly that dream of accessibility to this kind of house has somewhat diminished. And then you also have this. This is a town called Harlow, outside London. And the previous British government had a policy where they removed the restrictions on converting offices into homes, which they saw as a very kind of quick and effective way of achieving more housing units. Unfortunately, converted offices, unless you're very careful, do not make good homes. This then got into a sort of toxic combination with the policies of local government in London, who have a statutory obligation to house people who are described as statutorily homeless. That's a kind of certain definition. But they don't have to house them on their own territory. So because these places were cheap, they shipped people out of the places where they lived and made them live in these converted office blocks, which are kind of like in car parks. They're in business parks. There's no schools. There's no shops. These people are completely removed from their family social networks. The interiors are just the wrong shape for housing. They have poor ventilation. And the only possible justification for this policy of converting offices into homes is that in a market you could say, well, you get very cheap homes that way, and if somebody is prepared to live in one of these places in order to live somewhere very cheaply, that's how the free market works, arguably. But here you have people who are obliged to live there because they have no choice. So here you see kids playing in a car park because there's nowhere else to play. So that is at the sort of other end of that dream that I just described. So how did we get to this point? And this is actually from Canada, just to make this a very obvious point that homelessness, poor housing conditions is an almost universal problem. Okay, now I'm just going to talk through how this happened in Britain. I'm going to give you a kind of lightning history of the last century in housing. So that's what I was just talking about, this kind of suburban dream, which was a huge thing in the 20s and 30s. British cities expanded massively with this new kind of suburban housing, which was built by the private sector but was encouraged and stimulated by government tax incentives. And so that kind of single-family house and a street that's sort of ideally quite leafy, they have gardens. So the area of London doubled between the First and the Second World War, thanks to this kind of development. However, that was not the whole story, because you still had slums of the kind that was sort of famous in the 19th century, but they didn't stop when Queen Victoria left the throne. And so alongside the image I just showed you, you also had people continuing to live in places like this. Then there was a war, there was bombing, a lot of housing was destroyed, which then, after the war, a left-wing government came to power who saw the opportunity created by destruction of the war, but also by the kind of mobilization that the war involves of resources. They saw the opportunity to apply that to peacetime and to build new homes that would serve people at every level of income. And Nye Bevan was the minister in charge, and that's what he said. Again, I'll leave you to read it. So there's this idea that everyone should live together in a sort of shared community. That is a project that arose from it. It's called Bevan Court in North London. So this kind of idealistic, modernistic housing. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And that led to sort of transformation that lasted a generation, where it was governments, whether they were of the right or the left, felt it was they had to build a lot of social housing, or council housing, as it's usually called in Britain. And so the government that came into power after the 1945 Labour government was a conservative right-wing government, but they won the election on the basis they would build more public housing. And the architecture that went with it, some of it was good, some of it was bad. This is Neve Brown, who was worked for the London Borough of Camden, and this is one of the most kind of talked about, admired projects of that whole programme. Then in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher came to power, and she decided to roll that all back. She promoted what she called the property owning democracy, which was a huge concept for her. And the idea was to get as many people as possible to own their own homes, and they would be the better for it, they would be happier for it. And also she believed that the country would be better for it, because she believed that if you own a home, you have a sort of stake in the economy, and that makes you into a more responsible sort of participant in the economy. I'm trying to avoid the word society, because she famously said there's no such thing as society. One of her policies was that if you lived in social housing, council housing, you could buy it. And this is one of the very first households to take advantage of that policy. And there she is with a photo opportunity with this happy family, who in fact were not so happy after that, because it all went wrong for them. And so this was her philosophy. And, there's a lot of that is fine. People like to own their own homes if they can. Not everyone, but a lot of people, most people possibly. There's definitely huge advantages to it. But it's not the only way to live. But it also, the way she implemented it, led to a kind of long period of time that we are still in which a home was not only a place to live, but it was also a kind of instrument of investment and speculation. So the way she encouraged home ownership was firstly by selling council houses, but also by relaxing lending rules, mortgage rules, so that people could borrow money more easily, without encouraging a kind of corresponding increase in supply of homes. So what that created was an increasing demand, but without increasing supply, so there was inflation in house prices. And she created a culture where inflation in house prices was seen as a good thing. It was something to be celebrated, whereas in every other commodity you can think of, inflation was considered a bad thing. It was great. Oh, house prices have gone up 15, 20% last year. That's very exciting. But of course, it's only exciting to the people who already own, because if you don't own, that's bad news, because it puts the prospect of having a home further and further away. However, successive governments adopted that philosophy and took us to the situation that I just described. Okay, so what can architects do about all of this? This is not a purely architectural issue. It's obviously a political issue. It's an economic issue. It's a social issue. So architects can't solve everything by themselves, even though they sometimes like to think they can. But what they can do is, above all, design. That is architects' number one skill, and I'll show you what I mean by that in a bit. They can plan. That's a form of design, really, at a larger scale. And they can campaign. They can, as citizens who are particularly informed about these issues, they can push for certain things to happen. They can put ideas into the conversation. And before I go into the sort of contemporary version of that, I just want to go into more detail about what happened in the post-war period in Britain, when the Labour government came to power and they faced a housing crisis as big as the one we have now, but also different. The first thing they did was build emergency housing. These are called prefabs. So these were houses that were designed to be built extremely cheaply and quickly, and they were only meant to be temporary in order to house people who'd been bombed out by the war. In fact, they proved quite popular and lasted longer than they were meant to, but they've almost all disappeared now. Then they built public housing, like Bevan Court, which I showed you before. There it is now. This was designed by Bertold Lubetkin, who was one of the best British modernists, and his practice Tecton. And he said, nothing is too good for ordinary people. And inside this block, you have this staircase, which is a quite fabulous piece of architecture, in my opinion. There's a sort of geometric, spatial creation. Lubetkin came from Russia, so he was very inspired by Russian constructivists. But it also has a social purpose, so the staircase is seen as a place where people can meet, talk to each other, connect with each other across the balconies. But it wasn't all modernist housing blocks. Council housing could also be rural, this kind of more sort of traditional, modest, domestic scale work. There's a practice called Taylor and Green in the county of Suffolk, who did these very beautiful little simple houses. That government also inaugurated the British New Towns movement, which was a series of new towns which I think now house something like 2.5 million people. This is Milton Keynes, which was the biggest, last, and probably best of them. And an important thing about new towns was the way they were financed. So what happened is the government would buy land. They would form something called a development corporation, which is a kind of agency that owns the land, builds the infrastructure, builds the schools, builds the public buildings, and then sells the land to development companies to build homes. And through that process, what happens is the value of land goes up, but because the land is publicly owned, that uplift in value goes into public benefits. And that's based on a model that Ebenezer Howard proposed when he kind of invented the Garden City at the end of the 19th century. So the uplift in value of land, instead of just going into private profit, goes to public benefit. And in fact, the whole New Towns movement ended up costing the British Treasury, the British government, nothing for that reason. So they had to invest a lot up front, but because the value in land increased as it was meant to, that covered all their costs. And so in Milton Keynes, you see there's a pretty close correlation between what the architects dreamt of and what was actually built. And a feature of Milton Keynes is they have these parks, and they have a kind of, I'm not sure what the word is, but a foundation effectively. So money that came from this uplift in value was put into a pot that couldn't be spent on anything except as a source of capital, the income from which pays for the maintenance of the parks. So the parks, the public spaces remain very well looked after as a result of this arrangement. And that same government introduced planning laws. So at the same time they created things, they built things, they had laws to control what happens. Britain being a small country, land is a much more kind of precious resource than it is in Canada. So they wanted to sort of guard against uncontrolled sprawl, and they invented the Green Belt. And so this is an area around big cities that is where the idea is to preserve countryside and to make it extremely hard to build. And this is a map of green belts in Britain, and as you see, they're quite big. The green belt around London is 3 times the area of the city itself. So they're restricted on the one hand, but they also actively promoted development. What eventually happened is the side of those policies that was constructive, that was about building things, making things happen, that fell away because the ideology was that government should not do those things. But the aspect that's about restriction remained, and so the green belts remains an extremely powerful designation. And although I'm all for preserving green space, that has become a problem because it constricts the supply of land so much that it makes it hard to build new homes. And not all the green belt is all that green either. Some of it is quite poor quality land, and you wouldn't have to build on very much of it to make a very significant difference. So, to the supply of housing. So, for some time, people have been saying, well, maybe we could build on the green belt a bit. So, what can architects do? Design, plan, campaign. If this was a TED talk, I'd now have 3 sections. One would be called design, one would be called plan, one would be called campaign. But actually, the 3 things are more sort of interwoven with each other. So I can't really do that. So this, I'd say, is a combination of planning and campaigning. This was a bit more than 10 years ago. A design company called Urbed came up with a proposal for building on the green belt of an imaginary city, which actually is quite like Oxford. And so Oxford has a green belt, some of which is not very good quality land. It's not a kind of wonderful place to go for a walk. And it has the effect of very severely constricting development and pushing up the value of houses. So these people said, well, what you can do is you can build on some of the green belt, you capture the increase in value in the way that new towns did, and that pays for public transport, for schools, public facilities. It also pays for parks, country parks that are accessible, which, although obviously the area of green space diminishes, what remains is actually a much more ecologically beneficial, much more pleasant, much more an amenity for people to use. That's a proposal, but actually something like this is now happening. This is a town called Halton, outside the city of Rugby. And this is built by developers with some help from the government, but they're kind of a bit more enlightened than your average developers. And here the idea is to structure the city around these kind of green routes, which you can see. So they're kind of like, is my pointer appearing? Yes, it is. So these are kind of linear parks that structure the whole town, which are very pleasant. Some of them have water flowing through them. They connect up with the surrounding countryside. And it's designed so that if you're taking your kids to school, if you're going to the shops, if you're going to see your neighbours, you walk through these routes or you cycle through them, which gives you a more enjoyable experience. It means you're more likely to walk and cycle rather than drive. It means you're more likely to meet your neighbours, etc. So there it is being built. And I mean, architecturally speaking, the houses are sort of not super exciting architecture, but that's not the main point. The point is what happens in the space between. And then the developers also realize that a school is a very important civic building in any community. It's important for the kids, it's important for the parents, but also things can happen there for adults outside school hours. So this site was a radio station, and so they took the old control building of the radio station and made it into a school. Another campaign, architect called Ben Derbyshire came up with the idea of suburbia, which is where you have a suburban development, like in that slide I showed from the 1930s of that huge area of suburban housing. That's not very high density. He said you could actually rebuild some of that at a somewhat higher density, like 4 or 5 stories rather than 2. You can do it especially near railway stations, so you encourage people to use public transport. And you can just raise the level of housing without building gigantic towers, and also while creating, again, shared spaces that are enjoyable for everyone. So again, this is a campaigning proposal, and there's signs that it might actually happen. And this more recently is a practice called RCKO, who said, well, you can build on golf courses. There's a statistic that says there's as much land in Britain is given to golf courses as to houses, and by which it means the area that houses actually occupy themselves rather than their gardens and their streets. But it's still a very striking statistic. And so they're very big areas of land that are not really publicly available. And so these architects said, well, you could actually build quite a lot of housing around the edge of the golf courses, and you could create gardens that are of more use to general public than a golf course, and also the golf course could get quite rich. And as a result of that, some golf courses have come to these architects and said, well, actually, we quite like your idea. And again, this was just sort of put out there. It got a lot of media attention, and it's something that could happen. So what I've shown you is planning and campaigning combined. I'm now going to show you a bit of design. This is an architect, Peter Barber, who I think is like the best housing architect in Britain and one of the best in the world. And here's a project in the suburbs of London, which is next to a big road. It's, in a way, a pretty terrible place to put homes. But when you've got a severe shortage of land, people start building homes anywhere they can. And if you've got a little bit of scrap land next to a big road, somebody will decide it's worth building there. And what he did is he built this block that acts as a kind of barrier between the road and this internal space. And behind this barrier, there's this very peaceful shared kind of street, except you can't drive down it, it's for pedestrians only. And there's a kind of intimacy and scale to it, and people have their private courts and balconies, but there's also a very successful shared space. Sorry, I just... and I think this is really great use of architecture, because without design, without the skills of an architect, something like this could never have happened. You would have had a pretty miserable bunch of units next to a nasty road, and instead you've created something quite lovely. And then another thing I like about Peter Barber is that he plays around, he's expressive, there's a bit of fantasy about him, all of which he does on the same kind of budgets as people who do considerably more boring houses. Okay, and as Inderby has said, I've also been looking at housing outside Britain, especially in Spain. And this is a quite amazing program done in the Balearic Islands, which are the Mediterranean islands that include Mallorca, Minorca, and Ibiza. And there's an agency there called IBAVI, which is a public agency which builds social housing. And for the last 5 years, unfortunately it's stopped now because there's a change of government, but they had an amazing program of building social housing using local materials and local skills. So they used stone from local quarries. They did deals with the quarries, with the stone companies, saying, if we build a certain amount of housing out of stone, can you invest in the necessary equipment to make that happen? And can we have the economies of scale that it's not too expensive? And the result of that is social housing for people who can't otherwise afford a home. This is made out of solid stone, which is kind of almost unbelievable. And again, there's a really strong sense of what the shared space is. Creating a house is not just creating some rooms behind a front door, it's also creating the space around, outside, between you and your neighbours. again, this is almost unbelievable that this is social housing, but it is. And by using this solid stone, that also had huge environmental benefits because the stone controls the temperature. It takes a long time to heat up and cool down. It acts as this kind of thermal heat sink. So these houses don't have air conditioning, and they also need very little heating in winter, which of course is also nice for the residents because they have very minimal energy bills. And some of them have these central courts, which are designed to sort of pull the air through and extract it naturally. So, you open the windows and the vents and the air just sort of gets drawn through, and that helps to cool it. This is another of those projects by the architects called Peris and Toral. And again, very handsome project made of stone. Again, consideration given to these shared spaces. So you have these shared kind of galleries for access. You have these little courts, which is also kind of part of the experience of living there. You don't have a private garden, but you do feel like all this shared space is kind of an extension of your home. And then the homes are also designed so they open very naturally onto these spaces. So they're not just corridors, they're not just circulation, they're not like a sort of lift lobby. They're actually part of a positive part of the experience of living there. And here they are internally. And on the picture on the right, you're looking out onto one of these walkways. So you feel quite comfortable about leaving your doors open, partly because you're in the Mediterranean, so it's nice and warm. But also there's enough kind of shelter that you don't feel threatened. You don't feel, some stranger is going to come and do you harm. You feel enough sense of community with your neighbours that you can just open the front door and that circulation space becomes an extension of your home. Indibir, I have no idea how I'm doing for time, but yeah, how long have I got? Okay. Okay, and then this is Barcelona, where again they have a really good housing policy. They have these sort of big agencies that are set up by government, but which have quite a lot of autonomy, and they do deals with municipalities where the municipality supplies the land, and there's the future revenue from the rents, which is reduced rent because it's social housing, but that creates a package that is sufficient to finance good new housing. So these are the same architects, Peris and Toral, as did the social housing in the Balearics that I just showed. And I'm talking about this block here. So here we are in a kind of high density urban environment, lots of apartment blocks of a kind of pretty standard kind. And this is the building they created within it. Okay, one of their ideas, which has become quite popular in new housing in Barcelona, is to get away from the conventional apartment plan. So a traditional apartment in Barcelona and in most places is kind of hierarchical. You have a living room, you have a master bedroom, which are sort of bigger, grander spaces than the kitchen and sort of the other bedrooms. What they do here is they create rooms of exactly the same size as each other, which can then be inhabited in different ways, depending on how your life changes, how many children you have, how sociable you want to be. And they also managed to design it so there are no corridors inside the apartment, so every space becomes part of the habitable space. And you might have some skepticism about this, but I have seen it, and it works. And then again, you have this shared circulation, which is not just circulation, it's an extension of the space. It's a social space, it's part of the life of the building. And that's a wooden model which shows the same thing in a kind of pretty way. And this building is also entirely built out of mass timber, which of course is more environmental than steel and concrete. And it also means you can leave some of it exposed, so that creates a more attractive environment to live in. And again, this is social housing, and these are quite beautiful places to live. And again, you have these shared common spaces, and you have the exposed timber, which gives a certain quality to the place. Nice balconies. And there it is on the outside, and some of you might look at that and say, ooh, that's a bit severe. But I think it works in Barcelona, partly because they have a tradition of kind of apartment living, but also this is done on a restricted budget, and I think the architects have correctly put their investment in things like the timber structure above all, and rather than the sort of facade. And I think it works basically. Okay, now I'm going to make things a bit more complicated again. So over the last few years, architects in the construction industry have rather belatedly realized that the sheer fact of building something and demolishing a building and then building a new one has a very big environmental impact, uses a lot of resources, it creates a lot of emissions. So, you want to not build things if you possibly can. I mean, for a long time, architects were very interested in the environmental effects of building in use. In other words, how much energy they use in heating and air conditioning, etc., while somehow not noticing this kind of very obvious fact that building has an impact. So here's a slightly extreme statement in the Architectural Review: demolish nothing. It's probably impossible to live up to that. But if you're talking about addressing the housing crisis by building lots of new homes, you have a bit of a problem, because that will have an environmental impact. And somebody worked out that if all the new homes that are supposed to be built in Britain in the next 15 years are built, then that will blow the country's entire carbon budget as set out in the Paris Agreement, just on building houses. So this is something that no one has faced up to really fully, partly because it's extremely hard to face up to it. You have competing interests of two good things: better, more affordable, more available housing on the one hand, and not destroying the environment on the other. And here, design can really play a part, because it is a design problem. So at the same time that there's this huge demand for housing, there is diminishing demand for office space. And this is the HSBC Tower in Canary Wharf, designed by Norman Foster, built about 20 years ago. And the bank, HSBC, is going to vacate that building in a few years. Their lease is running out. They decide it doesn't meet their needs anymore. And it's quite typical of a lot of office buildings, because these kind of office behemoths are less popular than they used to be for a number of reasons. So you'd say, well, okay, here's a building. I think it's 1 million square feet, maybe more. Anyway, it's big. And wouldn't it be nice to make that into housing? But of course, it's not very easy, because you don't have this kind of windows that you have in residential buildings. You don't have external space. You have a deep plan where you're a long way from windows, etc. So this is for sure a design problem, and if you could crack it, you'd be doing a great thing, because you would find a way to reuse a lot of redundant built space and create new housing. And I'd love to show you lots of examples of people who've done this, but there's not an awful lot yet. This is an example. This is a development called Îlot Saint-Germain in Paris, where they also have a kind of great public housing program. And here is an old office block where an extra layer of kind of balconies has been added, which makes it into social housing. However, this is helped by the fact that this particular office block is kind of quite shallow. It's not a hugely deep plan building like the HSBC tower I just showed you. But anyway, it's progress. But I think where people might learn from is a building like this by the French architects Lacaton and Vassal. This is not an office building. It's a 1960s housing block that needed renovation. And their approach was to add something to the existing building. So they added a whole layer of winter gardens, which created a kind of bonus space, which made the apartments, which were kind of quite problematic and not working very well, much more attractive, while also dealing with issues of insulation and kind of recladding. So the conventional way of approaching a block like this would be to sort of slather a kind of new skin of insulating and waterproof material, such as was put on Grenfell Tower with terrible results, without actually improving the inside of the building in any way. Lacaton Vassal said, you don't have to do that. You can add an extra layer that actually gives something new to the space, while solving all the technical issues of insulation and waterproofing and so on. And I would argue that that kind of thinking could usefully be applied to the conversion of office spaces. And it's really key that there's an element of generosity about it. In other words, if you try and do the usual developer's thing, which is to say a 2-bedroom flat is this many square feet, and it has to have this much in terms of bathroom and kitchen, and it can't be anything more because that's inefficient, then you can never do this kind of work. You have to say, okay, this is an office building. It has certain qualities that are actually good, like they might have high ceilings, they might have great views, they're well serviced, but they're also kind of not that easy to convert into conventional flats. Therefore, you have to give yourself a bit more space. You say, well, to make this work, I have to do a flat that's a bit bigger than normal. But the reward for that is terrific, because you get new homes out of buildings that would otherwise be very hard to use. And finally, I would say that given this problem, given the environmental impact of new building, that doesn't mean, it's not feasible to say, therefore you just have to stop building. That just can't happen. But what you do build, obviously it has to be environmental as possible, and it also has to address whatever the needs are in housing in a very focused way. So, what the current British government is doing is they're trying to sort of relax the planning system so the private sector builds new homes. There's quite a lot wrong with that. One is, I don't think the private sector will build those new homes. The other thing is those new homes are not necessarily the ones that address people's need the most. So, if you're going to build new homes, you should make sure that a good number of them are addressing need, which I would say means it has to be affordable housing, it has to be social housing, it has to be something where the state plays a role in making it happen. So I'm going to finish off back in Barcelona. This is a hostel for homeless women by a company called Vivas Architects. And it's a really beautiful building. Again, it's a timber structure. It's got these generous sort of shared spaces. It has the timber, which gives it a lovely quality. It has some nice tile work, which gives it also a kind of, lifts it a bit. And this is for homeless people. This is for people who are kind of in the most desperate situation. And they find a way to build a building like this without it being insanely expensive. So, if they could do it in Barcelona, I don't really know why they can't do it elsewhere. Okay, thank you.
So perhaps we'll just take a minute in case people want to leave, because it's very loud when we exit, and then Rowan will very generously take questions from the audience. So in case anyone wants to exit, we'll just take a little break. Thanks, Rowan. Yeah, the exit is very loud.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm really pleased. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. You're going to mark down the ones who leave.
I'm delighted they came. I'm hoping they're going back to studio.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
The light wasn't too bad.
No, and they changed it down a bit. So. Oh yeah.
Okay, so we'll open it to the audience. So we have a question right here.
Hi.
My name is Becky. I'm actually the city councillor for the area.
Uh-huh.
So I have a comment and then I have a question.
Okay,
This is a very
cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My name is Stephanie. I'm the city councillor. Welcome to my board, everybody. Welcome. And actually, I just want to make I know everybody was repping for Carleton, but you are in UGG's territory. So I just want to make that very clear. So first comment, your slogan you had at the beginning, what was it? Plan, design, slay? Or what was
Design, plan, campaign.
Yeah, okay, so you need to market that because you could use that for like global warming, public transit, traffic calming, like it's really, really great, so.
Okay.
Anyway, and then the other thing I had is you said something which is very relevant to here, which is the idea is to relax the rules and then the private sector will come in
Yeah.
and they're gonna build everything that we need, which we're noticing here in the city is not really happening.
Mm-hmm.
And in other cities as well, but I was just wondering if you had any other private sector examples where it did work? Because we're kind of limited in the tools that we have with the city to incentivize.
Okay. Okay, well, there's a kind of philosophical point here, which is that when the 1945 Labour government in Britain did all the things I talked about, including introduced a sort of modern planning system, they nationalised development rights. They said, you own land, but you don't own the right to develop on it without permission. And that's never actually quite been repealed, although it's kind of very much watered down. But the principle behind that is that development rights, planning permission is public property. So when you give someone planning permission, you are giving them public property. Therefore, you can expect something in return, or you can ask something in return. And that's based on a kind of important principle, which is, you don't, although it's called private property, it's never completely private, because the value of land is created by not just what you do, but by what other people do and what the community does in terms of infrastructure and other businesses and other homes and so on. And I talk about this in my book, and there's philosophers have talked about this, etc. And also what you do on your land also affects other people negatively, like pollution and fire hazards and things like that. So, land is never completely private. So to come back to what you're saying, that in principle gives leverage to get public benefits out of land. What I have a real problem with is, which is kind of happening, has been happening in Britain and is continuing to happen, is the idea that we just give this away. We, the public, the government, give away the property that's inherent in development rights. And what that does is that when you relax planning consent, the land value goes up. So when there was this thing that I talked about of the government saying, you can make offices into homes without planning permission, which led to those office block kids having to live in those places, what immediately happened is anybody who owned a kind of mediocre office building saw the value of their property double. So that was in effect money given by the government to the owners of those buildings. And so the trick is to, which happens in a lot of countries, including Britain, is to get something back from the public in giving those consents. And I imagine something exists here of that kind. The difficulty with that is actually making it happen, and developers always say, oh, well, how can you expect us to do our business if you are making all these demands of us? And sometimes there's a truth in that. And it varies very differently from place to place and depending what the values are and so on. But another way around it is the development corporation model that I described with new towns, where a public agency buys property and increases the value through its own actions and raises value in that way. It's not easy. It takes political will. It means you have to argue with developers. You need the sort of laws and the mechanisms to do it. I'm afraid I can't comment on what those are here because I know nothing about it. But those are the kind of instruments that are available. Does that make sense to you? Or, yeah.
That's right here in the front.
So I'd also say sometimes public bodies should just put money into these things because it's a capital investment and you're going to keep it in the future. So it's not you're just throwing taxpayers' money away. You've got something that's going to be a benefit for a long time. Sorry, this other question.
You had put up a very good quote there from, I forget, was it
Bevan, yeah.
About this kind of idea of the pepper pot. Like the
Yeah,
dog
yeah.
the butcher.
Yeah,
That's a great concept,
yeah,
ideal. But it's really hard to attain.
yeah,
And just thinking about how we're trying to find housing, not just more housing, but housing for the most vulnerable. Like, what are some of the aspects that Britain's dealing with?
Well, I mean, that didn't really happen in Britain because council housing became housing of last resort, which it was not meant to be, but because of the demands on it, that's what it became. In other words, it became something that was hard to obtain unless you were in great need. And so therefore, they kind of became ghettos of the people of greatest need. And it became a kind of stigmatized thing that if you live in a council house, that was seen as kind of inferior to living in another kind of home. It has happened to the extent that a city like London, there's a real mixture. You get social housing and expensive private housing. You still get them mixed up within a given neighbourhood. So there is that kind of pepper potting to that degree. Where it does work is in Vienna and Singapore. I believe, I'm really not very expert on Singapore, but these are both cities where publicly provided housing accounts for a huge amount of the housing stock, and it's not only for the poorest people, and you pay rent according to what you can afford, and so that's a better way of doing it, I would say. So to see the public sector as a provider of housing that is not just housing of last resort is a good way to go, and it's possible. And it's also a way of kind of getting around the stagnation in the market I mean, another reason I'm skeptical of this idea that you just relax planning permission and then you let the market solve the situation is that in Britain, at least, the house builders just stop building if they start building so much that the value of their product goes down. They just don't build because obviously they don't want the product of their product to go down, the cost of the value of their product to go down. And that has happened consistently for a long time. And that's partly because there's a sort of semi-monopolistic situation, so the market doesn't work quite as it should. There's quite a small number of big companies doing this. But so the private sector has been given a pretty good chance to address these problems over a long time, and it hasn't succeeded. So I think alongside the private sector, you do need an active public sector in providing housing. And, you know, I'm not a socialist myself. I'm not a believer that the state can cure everything. I've got nothing against private companies building houses, but they demonstrably have not been able to address all the issues unaided alone, so you need something else. Yeah.
So I was very curious and intrigued by the building, I think it was in the green belt around Oxford that you talked about.
Oh yeah, well it was a kind of a plan rather than a...
And I'm curious to know, if you're aware of what is the political response?
Oh, okay.
I don't think I'm going to, you're saying that this might start a holy war in the city.
Well, absolutely. Okay, so this was a kind of speculative proposal. It was actually submitted to for a prize for economics, which it won. And yeah, you get absolutely colossal resistance to building in the greenbelt, you know, partly because people, you know, they want to preserve green space, they want to preserve their walks in the countryside. That's very understandable. Partly because people just don't want other people near them, I'm afraid, is sometimes a factor. So Exeter is a made-up city. It doesn't really exist, but it was kind of based on Oxford. And I wrote an article about Greenbelt, and I went to Oxford. I went to the Oxford Greenbelt. I went to a part of it which was green, but it wasn't a terribly pleasant place. And I met people who objected to the idea of development on Greenbelt. And I said, well, you know, if you built something like this, you'd have nicer places to go for a walk, you'd have better public transport, you'd have better facilities, and there'd be more homes for people. And they made what was quite a reasonable point, is that, well, we don't believe that would really happen, because they haven't seen it happen. Because, you know, what usually happens is you get house builders just come in and they build their usual standard sort of poor quality product that doesn't have great amenities, great green space attached to it. So that's, you know, a genuine political difficulty. And, you know, that's why I'm encouraged by this, because it is actually a demonstration of those principles. And crucially, they build, in a development like this, they build the infrastructure first. So they build the parks and the green spaces and the school buildings before the housing comes in, or alongside it. Whereas what typically happens is developers make lots of promises, build the houses, and then you try and get them to plant some trees and they've gone. And the reason this could happen here was partly because there was some government sort of assistance to it in terms of loans and so on, but also because the funding model was, this particular property company was taking a long-term view. They had a sort of 20 to 30 year view of their investment. So it was in their interests to make sure that trees would live and that the gardens would work and so on. And that's sort of partly to do with the technicality of property companies in Britain, which I probably don't need to go into. But yeah, so building on the Greenbelt is a very politically tough issue, and to make it work, you can't just beat people over the head with a hammer and say you've got to accept this new housing because it's good for society. You have to give something back to them to say, well, actually, this is going to be good for everyone because there will be parks, public amenities. And then to really make that happen is a challenge, but it can be done.
My name is Jules Gregoire. I study architecture technology, and I'm wondering, with a lot of this housing and the way that it's being developed, it can be seen as very controversial for a lot of people who live in very traditionally structured neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And I'm finding like at public discussions and when you ask community members about new developments, whether it's social housing, affordable housing, shelter spaces, you get a lot of pushback, a lot
Yeah.
of NIMBYism. So
Yeah.
can you speak to how a lot of these really radical kind of projects have overcome some of that NIMBYism that we encounter?
Yeah. I mean, as I just said, it helps if you can, as part of the package, you can bring demonstrable benefits to the people who are already there, which where you have very high land values, that should actually be easier to achieve because of the gap in the value of the land without permission and the gap in value of land with permission. That should give you some sort of financial room to play with. But I think in a city like Barcelona, sometimes, or any city, sometimes things have to be built that not everyone is happy with, because the community you're serving is not just the people who live next door, it's the whole city. And you cannot always conduct all your public policy or your planning policy on the basis of the people next door, because they're not the only people you're serving. And I guess a difficult part of all this is the people who live next door are real people who are really there, who can be consulted. The people who will benefit are not there. They're sort of somewhere, imaginary people in the future. So that creates it's a political problem, what can I say? But it, takes some political will to get around it. And ideally you don't have a confrontation, but sometimes you do. Sorry, can I just go back to just an interesting detail about this? So this imaginary site was unfortunately just outside the parliamentary constituency of David Cameron, who was the Prime Minister at the time. So when this project won the Economics Prize, and there's quite a lot of news about it, David Cameron the next day said, this is not going to happen, because he would have upset his own voters. So that's the kind of political issues you have to deal with.
Maybe we'll take two more questions. So there's one here and then one right there in the second row. Mm-hmm. And then I think, Rowan, you wouldn't mind hanging out a little bit afterwards.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So we'll take two more questions, then we will invite the audience down to chat with Rowan for about 10 minutes. Please.
Thanks so much for the presentation. I had a couple quick thoughts when you were talking. One was about, I know you mentioned time horizon on this was about 30 years. And I'm wondering whether, when you're talking about the time horizon of the project, from concept to implementation, your environment is changing enough that are you able to actually deliver on what you were hoping on? I'm thinking of the problems that we have now.
Yeah.
Not the same when 10 years ago when we have different market conditions and different immigration policies. Right?
Yeah.
We were creating new problems based
Yeah.
on that, with the solutions we're putting in place. So I'm just kind of wondering how you can plan ahead, with that in mind, in terms of where you think things are going.
I mean, it's a huge problem that planning, design, development is a really, really slow business. And these problems are urgent, and as you say, change. On the other hand, to some degree, a home is a home is a home. So if you have a well-designed home and a well-planned community, that can respond to needs that you can't predict. So, good housing stock of a kind that you have in Britain, that you have here, actually has an ability to evolve to different needs. So, a lot of London is Victorian or 18th century, and it was designed for a world that is completely different from the world we live in now. But those houses are still popular and successful because they've kind of got good basic principles. So that's one answer. It helps to have a little bit of generosity. If you design things so that the most sort of minimal economic possible units, you actually deprive yourself of a kind of headroom, legroom, whatever you want to call it, to respond to change. But also another question that, again, architects could maybe contribute to is, can you build emergency housing really fast? So I showed you the prefabs that the 1945 government built, those incredibly basic homes that were a response to a real emergency, which was wartime destruction. Is there a way of doing that now that would actually create decent places to live? Is there a way of doing a kind of prefab approach to office conversion so you could really quickly convert offices in a way that they make good homes? I don't have no examples to show you because I don't think they exist, but that I'd say there's a role for architects there in doing that. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
But the garden city, the idea of cost neutral development.
Yeah.
Should sell in those places, but I think the idea of trying to, whether it's viewed as socialist or not, like trying to get something off the ground in certain locations might be easier than others.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I'm just wondering whether it's that, or even if you try to pitch the idea of green belt now, right? Like,
Yeah.
Some areas are more comfortable with urban sprawl than others.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, when it comes to design, how much of stuff are you left with, legacy decisions from before that have just carried forward? Whereas if you try and implement something new, could you get those same ideas out?
Well, those ideas were radical once. So the green belt was a very radical idea. It was actually invented in the early 1900s, and it was called a green girdle. And it was very much thinking about the lives of people who lived in the city, and it grew out of an anxiety that people who live in the city were not getting enough access to nature. So the idea was to create essentially a kind of park around the whole perimeter of the city that people in the city could enjoy. And I think the earliest versions were like a half a mile wide or something. And then through various sort of machinations of the planning system, you ended up with what I showed you, where it's 3 times the area of London, and it's no longer really serving London, it's serving the people who live in the Greenbelt. So if you live in London, as I do, you don't say, oh, I'm going to the Greenbelt this weekend. You might sometimes go to parts of it, but the people who get the most out of it are the people who live there. So what I'm saying is a radical planning idea becomes, it evolves. It becomes different from what it was originally meant to be. But that means that you can still invent new things. If you could invent the green belt 100 years ago, you can invent new things now.
So Canada has the dubious distinction of having the greatest increase in housing value over the last 25 years.
Oh, really?
And something like 3 times that of the US.
Okay.
50% more than Britain, and something like 5 times as much as say Germany or Spain. But we routinely face construction costs $300, $400, $500 a square foot.
Mm-hmm.
And we get into all these entanglements of affordable, deeply affordable market.
Yeah.
But it's fairly clear that and to cover that at a reasonable rental rate. So the inevitable conclusion from your presentation is one of state involvement.
Yeah.
At a time when the government itself is shedding a lot of office buildings
Yeah.
because they want to get out of owning real estate.
Mm.
We have a certain stripe of politician who talks about axing and tax and unleashing
Yeah.
the gatekeepers,
Yeah.
which indicates an attitude of less involvement
Yeah.
in this process. Or
I mean, why would you say housing costs are so high in Canada?
there are a variety of reasons. The climate in Canada is one of the most punishing in the world in terms of ranges of temperature. So what some
Uh-huh.
get away with in Spain or
Right, okay.
you can't get away with.
So it costs, it's construction cost, it costs more to build. Yeah. Uh-huh. But are the land values high as well? Because in Britain, it's like land values more than anything else. You know, the value of the land is kind of more than the cost of construction a lot of the time. And that's funny because Canada is extremely big. So it's interesting. You would have thought you wouldn't have a shortage of land. But anyway, I don't have the answer to that conundrum. Yeah, it's a hell of a battle. But it has happened before that, you know, the 1945 Labour government was extremely radical, and it was able to hugely change the direction of things. But also, and I have no idea how feasible this is in Canada, but the model of capturing land value in the British new towns, you know, there are ways of doing it where it's not simply throwing taxpayers' money into a bottomless pit. There are also ways of doing it so it's not just the government that owns everything, because we all know things can go badly wrong with that as well. You know, you can have agencies that deliver housing, as happens in Barcelona, that have a degree of autonomy from government and a degree of competence that they might not have if they were sort of purely a kind of government department. There's no perfect way of doing this, but there are tools out there that could be used more, shall we say, than have been the case. I mean, if I was standing here 40, 50 years ago, I might have been saying the problem is too much public housing, possibly. That was certainly a kind of widely held view that Margaret Thatcher, you know, picked up on. And there were some sort of very demonstrable failures at that time. But that was then, this is now, and I would say, you know, the experiment of putting so much faith in the market has not been fully successful. So it's time to maybe nudge it in a different direction.
Well, maybe I'll just...
Could I just come back to what you said?
Sure.
Because there's this really interesting thing. This is a more philosophical point, but it's something I talk about in my book, which is ever since the 18th century, there have been different attempts to describe what are the fundamental rights of human beings. You know, you have the Declaration of Independence, you have the American Constitution, you have the French Declaration of the Rights of Man after the French Revolution. And then this has continued into the 20th century. There are various post-war declarations by the United Nations and other people of what are fundamental human rights. And they always agree that the right to life is one, and they always agree that the right to liberty is one. And then sometimes they say property and sometimes they don't, and they kind of hedge around that. And so there was this version that was knocking around in the 18th century of life, liberty, and property, which came from John Locke originally. And but then the American formulation was life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is really striking, because whereas the French formulation was life, liberty, and property. And that's quite funny, because the United States is obviously a country more obsessed with private property than any other in the world. So whereas France is not so much. but the kind of reason, why this sort of complication emerges is because life and liberty is that everyone can, in principle, have, whereas property is never going to be something that everyone has in terms of something as large as a home. Everyone might own, their clothes or something like that. But so property is different from other rights in that it's not something that people kind of inherently have. And, I think if you look at all the sort of discussions about private property and public property, that sort of fuzziness is at the heart of it. There's another version of this, which is instead of a right to property, you have a right to shelter, which in principle seems like a better way of putting it. Anyway.
Before we thank you. Dina for ULI is here to hang out, learn more about ULI. Rowan will stick around for 10 more minutes.
Yeah.
So please come down and introduce yourselves. And thank you, everyone, for coming out in -20. Rowan, thank you again.